Welcome. We're at the last session of the day for the first day of the 2022 Iowa Ideas Conference, but we've saved a great session for last as part of the Energy Environment track. I'm Erin Jordan, a Gazette reporter and moderator for this big idea session about the Big Muddy, the Mississippi River. It's a quick session, only 40 minutes, but we really want to involve our listeners and talk about ways we can all get involved in improving the water quality of the Mississippi River. We'll let all of our panelists introduce themselves in just a moment. First, we have a quick video from our track sponsor, Alliant Energy. All right. Well, as promised, let's hear from our panelists. Just if you could tell us briefly who you are and your organization and your connection to this topic. Should we start with Tegan?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Tegan Wendland. I'm the editorial director for the Mississippi River Basin Agriculture and Water Desk, which is based at the University of Missouri. And it's a big journalism collaboration with 10 news outlets through the Mississippi River Basin. We have reporters based at each of those outlets who report collaborative environmental journalism that we then distribute and share for free to any news outlet that wants to pick it up. And we've got two excellent reporters at the Gazette, including Erin, and I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you. Chris, would you like to go next?
I'm Chris Jones. I'm a research engineer with IIHR, Hydroscience and Engineering at the University of Iowa. I manage the university's network of water quality sensors that are deployed around the state of Iowa. And I also conduct research on contaminant hydrology in the Corn Belt agriculture. And so I spend some time on the Mississippi River almost every week. So
I want to come back to that. But first, Mike, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Mike Schmidt. I am the staff attorney for the Iowa Environmental Council, where I work on water quality, energy, and climate change issues. I previously worked in Minnesota for about 10 years for a nonprofit on water issues, and then for the state of Minnesota, excuse me, at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So I'm happy to be back in Iowa, where I'm originally from.
That's great. We've got some great representation from along the river here, Wisconsin, Iowa, Louisiana connections. And I think it's great to have that perspective. The Mississippi River is about 2,300 miles long from northern Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico and drains from, I think, 31 states, including Iowa. I wonder with the panelists, what you think about this. With so many different states and all types of industry connected to the river and different cultures and states, does that help or hinder collaboration in terms of water quality?
I mean, I think we found in our reporting that it's a real hindrance because there's sort of a patchwork of different policies surrounding runoff and solutions to runoff issues. I'm from Wisconsin originally, where I grew up drinking fresh spring water in the Driftless region. And now I live in New Orleans, which is where I'm based, down at the Delta, where I drink Mississippi River water that's been filtered a lot to the point where it almost tastes a bit chlorinated. You have to really do a lot to it to make it drinkable. And so I've witnessed every year in the decade that I've been here reporting on these issues that the dead zone here in where the river dumps into the Gulf of Mexico has not really decreased very much in size, despite all of these efforts upriver to reduce, in particular, fertilizer runoff from farms.
Yeah, I would agree with Tegan. The variation in the river from top to bottom really means that the identity of the river varies by state. Living in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, it's seen as kind of a treasure. You know, it's very, very clean through northern Minnesota where it starts. and there's lots of recreational opportunities. I canoed on the river from Minneapolis to St. Paul and had a great time, and biked through parks. Whereas in Iowa and farther south, it gets increasingly dirty, and there's more barge traffic and commercial traffic, and so it's more of an industrial resource instead of a natural resource for recreation and aquatic life and things like that.
Well, I would say, all the states bring something to the table, and, there's different expertise in different states. And so presumably that would be a positive, but I think it's painfully obvious that we need federal leadership if the Mississippi River is going to improve. And so, we ask a lot of it in terms of navigation, recreation, water supply, these sorts of things. And so, those stressors and uses, change from bottom to top, as the other folks have said here. And so I think we definitely need more federal leadership for the Mississippi River.
And it seems like, we've been reporting on the Gulf dead zone where there's just so little oxygen that wildlife can't survive there. But I wonder to what degree, Mike and Chris, do you think that registers for Iowans?
I feel like not very much. Iowans don't even seem to care enough about their water here in Iowa to vote for people who are willing to clean it up. So the fact that it's also polluted downstream, I don't think is changing how people behave here. I think we would have a lot more interest within our own state waters to clean it up than we would downstream, and we haven't been doing that.
So yeah, I agree. It doesn't resonate very well here, and to be quite honest, I don't know how well it resonates in Louisiana. I've heard, fishermen speak about this, and, they have some awareness that there's something wrong with the Mississippi River, and that it somehow connects to the phenomenon of the dead zone. But beyond that, they really don't know. And so, they hear things about farming and corn and fertilizer and so forth, but there's not a real in-depth understanding. And the problems down there are so enormous with the wetland erosion and the subsidence that, I think that the dead zone is just kind of a small piece down there, to be honest.
Yeah, just one of many problems that we face here on the coast because of coastal erosion and land loss, which has been an ongoing crisis in Louisiana. And I feel like that's something we're trying to address with this desk, is really trying to encourage people within the basin to think about themselves as a constituency, or to think about a shared identity up and down the river. Being someone who grew up at the headwaters and now lives at the Delta, I have a deep understanding of it. And it's easy for me to see those connections, but I think you're right. There are so many other, seemingly more pressing issues, at least down here in the South, that the dead zone is not necessarily a priority.
Now, Tegan, the Ag and Water Desk recently published a series about how increased rainfall is affecting the river basin. Obviously, there are lots of findings there, but I was wondering if you could share a couple of ways that climate change is affecting the river basin.
Sure. So we just published this 4-part series about increased rainfall and how rain is becoming intenser. It's falling in larger amounts, like in heavier bouts and shorter periods of time. Right now, we're in a bit of a drought down here in New Orleans and in much of the basin. So that's kind of interesting to release this rainfall series at this time when many states in the basin are experiencing a drought. But that's also another aspect of, the extreme weather patterns that we're seeing as a result of climate change. So the warmer it is, the more water evaporates, whether that's from the ocean or from rivers or from wherever. So then you've got more precipitation in the sky, and it falls in heavier bouts as a result. And so we're seeing increased flooding throughout the basin. While, of course, that's been a natural part of living on rivers, whether it's the Cedar River or the Mississippi River, for thousands of years, they flooded until we, levied them and tried to keep them straight and protect ourselves from that threat. But now we're facing this heavier rainfall from above, which kind of poses a new threat. And I think many of the viewers there in Iowa have probably had personal experiences with flash flooding in recent years as a result.
Yeah, definitely. So Chris, I wanted to, one of the things we're focusing on in this session is just the water quality of the Mississippi River. You were the lead investigator on a paper published in 2018 about Iowa's contribution to nitrate loading in the Mississippi River watershed. I was wondering if you could share some of the key findings from that.
Sure. So Iowa contributes about 30% of the nitrogen load over the long haul to the Gulf of Mexico. And so nitrogen is one of the two nutrients that drive the algae blooms that consequently drive the dead zone area. And so about 30% of it comes from Iowa. About 15% of the phosphorus comes from Iowa, not quite as much here as, relatively. And so we also see the nitrogen load from Iowa increasing quite a lot over the last 20 years. And so since 2003, it's probably almost doubled. And so we know in these marine ecosystems now that it's nitrogen that really drives these algae blooms. In the freshwater systems like Lake Erie, it's more the phosphorus, but at the Gulf, it is the nitrogen. And so, yes, as we have committed so much of our land to production, especially corn, and increase the number of animals that we have here, livestock animals, the amount of nitrogen that we lose to the Mississippi Basin is increasing.
So you're looking at us as being one of 12 states that touch the Mississippi River and 31 states in the basin, and we contribute 1/3.
Oh, yes. And, so the Missouri River, right, is the second biggest tributary of the Mississippi after the Ohio. And about 30% of Iowa drains to the Missouri River. The Missouri River is a huge watershed. It goes all the way to the Continental Divide in Yellowstone Park. And so Iowa has only 3% of the land area in the Missouri Basin, but we contribute about 55% of the nitrogen in the Missouri at the gauging station at Hermann, Missouri. And so we are a big contributor. There is no doubt.
And there's a pretty high concentration of animal operations in that Missouri River drainage area, right?
That's correct. Northwest Iowa drains to the Missouri and the Big Sioux River, which, all end up down there at Hermann, Missouri.
So Mike, the Iowa Environmental Council had a Mississippi River Day of Action last year. And one of the things specifically mentioned was all the cities that get their drinking water from the river. If there are high levels of nitrate in that source water, could you talk a little bit about what type of pressure that puts on cities?
Yeah, so the Safe Drinking Water Act has a requirement for public water suppliers to provide drinking water at less than 10 milligrams per liter of nitrate. And so if their source water is higher than that concentration, they have to mix it with other water, like groundwater wells that may be less impacted, or like Des Moines Water Works, they have to essentially remove that nitrate through a filtration system. And Des Moines Water Works has had to do that again this year after not having to for a little while, because they were able to mix their water because they have multiple sources. But a lot of cities don't have that option. And so they, we sometimes see notifications like Toledo in 2014, where they basically prohibited people from drinking the water for an extended period of time because it was unsafe due to an algae bloom. And even if we don't have algae blooms on the Des Moines River or the Mississippi River, or some of those smaller rivers that provide drinking water sources, the nitrate standard still applies and can be exceeded without an algae bloom being visible in the river. So it does definitely put pressure on those cities to find ways to comply with their Safe Drinking Water Act requirements, because if they don't, there can be pretty severe consequences not being able to provide drinking water to people. And it's the kind of thing where, unlike bacteria, boiling it does not solve the problem. It just concentrates the nitrate in the remaining water. So there's not an easy solution for those kinds of problems.
And doesn't nitrates, don't they pose some serious health threats, especially for vulnerable populations and young children, babies?
Yeah, so blue baby syndrome is a consequence of basically being fed nitrate laden water exceeding 10 milligrams per liter. So there are those acute effects. There are also chronic impacts from drinking high concentrations of nitrate over a longer period of time. So cancer, various types of cancer basically can or have been associated with drinking high nitrate concentrations in water. And those studies include studies from Iowa data. So it is basically happening here because our nitrate concentrations in the state are high.
So we've spent the last 15 minutes kind of talking about the problem here, you know, among others. There's probably lots of issues we could get into here, but I want to talk about some of the solutions. Chris, you mentioned you think more federal involvement is needed. There's a farm bill renewal coming up. What do you think the federal government, and this is open to anyone to answer, what do you think the federal government could do?
Well, I think it's no secret that I believe pollution from agriculture should be regulated. And so we have some regulation of the livestock industry, but it's not very robust, and enforcement, at least in Iowa, is almost nil. And so that needs to change. And we just are relying on the altruistic instincts of farmers to solve this. And I always say the problem isn't that farmers are evil, the problem is that they're human beings, and to think that they're going to do things that are not in their best interest, I think, is just a fantasy. And so we need to really strongly consider regulation of agricultural pollution. The second thing I'll say is we need to get rid of the renewable fuel standard. And the renewable fuel standard, the demise of ethanol is the best opportunity we've ever had to produce better water in the Corn Belt. And so that really needs to happen. And so we see these various initiatives, like with the carbon pipeline here in Iowa, that are trying to throw a life raft to ethanol. No, we should not be doing that. We should be hastening the end of ethanol so we can start to redesign our farming system. And I really would encourage groups in Iowa to start talking about that.
Yeah, I agree. We need to transition away from this corn soy rotation that ethanol has really pushed the state toward, and we need more diverse crops, cropping systems. We need more continuous cover on the landscape, because just planting corn and soybeans is not a healthy system for the state in terms of water quality and a number of other ways as well. And the Farm Bill can be a very big lever to advance that shift. We get on the order of $1 billion a year in subsidies through the Farm Bill in Iowa, and they largely go to corn and soybean production. And so if we could shift those, that would be a big help. And like Chris, the Iowa Environmental Council also supports regulating agriculture. We're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, which very explicitly regulates point sources of pollution like industrial facilities and wastewater treatment plants, and essentially exempted agriculture, which which has meant that while all of our other pollution sources have dropped, agriculture has become the dominant pollution source in states like Iowa. And the Farm Bill and federal policy is a way to change that, both in terms of the subsidies, the regulation or potential regulation, and things like conservation compliance. There are some regulatory structures in the Farm Bill now where you can't get certain subsidies if you don't have conservation plans for highly erodible land. And if we expanded that to a lot more land, that would be helpful. It was basically a demonstration that if you have requirements, it makes a big difference in terms of water quality. And we've seen that in other states as well, where they impose requirements and they get quick compliance. And it's not because they are paying 75 or 100% of the cost to do the practices that benefit the public.
Yeah, I think Minnesota has seen some positive results from their requirements to have buffers, by waterways, and that was a tough push initially. But a question from the audience here, this audience member says they totally agree with what Chris mentioned about federal leadership. Which federal agency or department would have the best connection or most influence or best ability to enforce regulations? Which agency do you wish had oversight?
Well, EPA had at one time was close to writing a TMDL for the Mississippi River and then backed away from it for, mysterious reasons that I think Aaron has investigated in the past. But and so would a TMDL on the Mississippi River solve the problem? Maybe not. I mean, but we need to start moving in that direction, at least incrementally. And so, we continue to run away from that. And so our Secretary of Agriculture, the former Iowa governor, is a very powerful person. And, he's publicly stated, USDA is not in favor of, any regulation of agriculture. The US is not going to follow the European Union and their program there to reduce agricultural pollution via regulation. And so I really think the culture does not exist in the agricultural agencies at either the federal or state level to really tackle this. And so, at the federal level, that leaves EPA, right?
Yeah, I think EPA makes the most sense. I was in Minnesota when a number of nonprofit groups, including the one that I worked for and the one that I work for now, sued EPA, largely because EPA didn't respond to a petition asking EPA to adopt a TMDL, a total maximum daily load, kind of a pollution diet for the Mississippi River. And I think we've seen, comparing my experience in Iowa to my experience in Minnesota, there are definitely benefits to having an agency that is focused on the regulatory side and not the side of subsidies or being friendly to the parties that they also need to regulate. In Minnesota, there is a Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, which basically implements the regulatory federal laws and state laws that apply in Minnesota. Whereas in Iowa, we have a DNR that regulates some things, but also does all these other things. And so some pieces of DNR are, I think, underfunded, including things like enforcement of feedlots and animal feeding operations. And so they don't, as Chris said, they don't do the kind of enforcement that actually leads to greater compliance and improved water quality. So I think having at the federal level, EPA do that kind of enforcement makes sense. They are the agency tasked with protecting water quality, and they regulate all of the other industries in the country through permitting. So including agriculture in that list of every other industry makes sense as a path forward.
There's new funding available in the Inflation Reduction Act passed in August to go toward climate smart agricultural practices. Tegan, I know you've reported on this and others, that you work with. I don't know if you wanted to start maybe talking about what some of those climate smart practices are.
I think I'm less equipped to talk about that than you probably, Erin. You know that a little better than I.
Well, I think, just some of the things that we've reported on, just our cover crops, those not only can use up some of that nitrate in the off season, but they keep the soil intact and reduce erosion. And yet they are used on still a very small share of acres out there, despite the subsidies that are available. Chris, Mike, what are some of the other climate smart practices in agriculture?
Well, no-till is one that we've known about for, decades, right? And so when you expose your organic matter in your soil to atmospheric oxygen, you oxidize the organic matter and it turns into CO2, and then it goes up into the atmosphere. And so, that's one. So anything that builds the soil organic matter is carbon. And so when we increase the amount of carbon in the soil, we decrease the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. The problem I have with this approach is that, there's no focus on emissions. And so it's all on the sequestration and the climate smart practices. And we're really scared to go, the emissions route with agriculture. And so when you look at their greenhouse gas footprint, what is it? Is it CO2 or is it some other stuff? Well, a whole heck of a lot of it is other stuff. Nitrous oxide, which is 300 times more powerful than CO2 as a greenhouse gas, and results from the over-application of nitrogen fertilizers. We don't want to talk about that. Tom Vilsack never talks about that. Never talks about emissions or the emissions from these livestock facilities, which is methane, which is also much, much more powerful than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. And so it's about time, it's past time that we, started talking about emissions. Yes, these climate smart practices are intuitive and make sense, but why should the public pay for this stuff when agriculture refuses to address their emissions? Doesn't make sense.
Well, and it's another opt-in solution, like you said earlier, relying on farmers to opt in. And it's only $1 billion, right, Erin?
I don't remember the exact amount, but yeah, it's probably not enough.
I think it started.
I was just wondering if we could also talk about topsoil loss, because that's another huge potential crisis. And we've been really focused on runoff in this conversation, but a lot of regenerative ag practices are better at retaining topsoil. And, we could be facing a pretty huge crisis if we keep depleting it at the level that we have been in the upper Midwest.
Yeah, I think lots of those regenerative practices have multiple benefits, and that's where, like Chris said, if we can build the carbon in the soil and then have these practices that provide other benefits as well, like retain the topsoil so that we aren't sending it downstream, and also provide benefits for water quality and resilience. If we build more wetlands, that provides multiple benefits. Don't let people farm in the floodplains. Don't let people build feeding operations in floodplains. Those kinds of things provide multiple benefits, and will probably be more effective long term than continuing to do what we've been doing. With the climate smart agriculture, I believe it started at $1 billion and then was expanded to $3 billion. And I think the program, from what I read, and all the program goal is to remove the CO2 equivalent of 10 million cars for 1 year. So at least to me, that doesn't seem like a huge number, because we're already transitioning to electric vehicles, and so you can get that kind of reduction in other ways that may be less expensive. So the only way it makes sense is if you have those other benefits beyond just the CO2 emissions, so that you are transitioning away from the corn soybean system that we have.
So if you
Question
look at the
from-
projects,
Chris.
if you look at the projects that were funded with the Climate Smart money, go down and read them, and almost all of them have some statement in there about creating markets for commodities that are produced using climate smart practices, creating markets, creating markets, creating markets. And so they're trying to, somehow incentivize the production of these commodities in ways that, the corporations will be able to green stamp it, right? Kellogg or Coca-Cola or whoever will be able to say, oh, well, look, Coca-Cola made with climate smart corn. And I don't agree with that. I don't agree with it. I think, that the whole climate smart program very clearly is intended to maintain production or maintain the existing production system. Okay. It's designed to maintain the existing production system. Well, we have all these environmental problems connected with the production system. Maybe we should think about changing it, right? We have these two crops that have produced an enormous amount of pollution, and we've been trying to pay farmers for decades to do it differently, and it hasn't worked. And so isn't it about time that we, thought of something different?
So I hear what you're saying, Chris, definitely about why should taxpayers and others keep paying to, farmers for these practices, to implement these practices. But I, was talking with someone with water treatment in the city of Cedar Rapids, and she said, well, it's kind of like a pay now, pay later, type deal. Like we can either invest in the watershed, in, different conservation practices, or we can build an expensive nitrate removal facility. It's kind of a tough call.
It's not a tough call. It's far cheaper to treat this pollution at the source than it is to go up in the watershed and implement practices. And so we know, so there's 1,600 Huck 12s in Iowa, Huck 12 size watershed. That's like 20 to 50,000 acres. There's over 1,600 of those. We know to improve water quality, it's probably going to cost at least $1 million per year per Huck 12. Okay, that's $1.7 billion per year for Iowa to clean up. And does it cost would nitrate removal at Cedar Rapids cost $1.7 billion? No, it would not. And so the fact of the matter is it's cheaper to treat at the source. And that's one of the reasons why we have the problem that we do.
Okay, so we are there other ideas, other ways you think government or individuals can get involved in this challenge that we're facing, both with the runoff and also topsoil loss?
Well, one way that people can take action right now is that the DNR is revising the rules applicable to animal feeding operations. And the rules right now do not require applying manure at the maximum return to nitrogen, which is not the environmental ideal, but it means that they aren't losing money by applying more nitrogen. So requiring that is something that the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy Science Assessment said would save millions of dollars a year, because people are over applying their nitrogen right now. So if we required lower nitrogen application rates, that's one way that saves money and pretty immediately reduces the nitrogen runoff. So that's something that I expect IEC will be submitting comments on shortly. The comment period is open until the end of next week.
Being from the Driftless region in rural southwestern Wisconsin, I think we could also benefit from more political and economic support for innovative local solutions like local food economies and a more diverse agricultural landscape, some of the regenerative ag practices that we talked about earlier, like rotational grazing. I'm from an area that is full of small organic farmers, and there's a very robust local food economy there. And it seems to be working very well. It's kind of an anomaly in terms of rural areas because there's a lack of monocrops because it's such a hilly landscape that it can't be cropped in that way. So just kind of an interesting example of what maybe some of our rural communities could look like.
I'm leaving it open for you, Chris.
Well, I think, Tegan makes a good point there. In Driftless area, you can't crop the way we do in the rest of Iowa. And rest assured, if the farmers there could, they would do it. Okay, and so the farms are not, they would not at all be sustainable trying to crop the way we do in the rest of Iowa. So, what can we do? I mean, that's the question we've been asking for 40 years. And, we're just loath to talk about things that have anything to do with laws. And so there's lots of things we can do that I think make sense. And so, for example, in Iowa, a couple of weeks ago, the governor just signed the proclamation, they can drive overweight vehicles on the roads. It happens every year, right, during harvest. Well, how about they can't do that unless they, have cover crops on a certain percentage of their field? Or, how about taxes, right? We really don't tax farmers very much. We know that they overuse commercial fertilizer. Maybe it should be taxed, right? I mean, that's what we did with cigarettes, right? We taxed it, the price of them went way up, and smoking has gone down. And so there's certain ways we could get creative with regulations, I think, that would move us in the right direction. Would one specific law solve the problem? Of course not. But the whole idea that agriculture can't work because our farms are too diverse is a bunch of baloney. When you drive across Iowa, look at these farms, they couldn't be more similar. They all grow the same 2 crops. They all plant at the same time. They harvest at the same time. They have the same approximate weather and so forth. So all these farms are, relatively the same. The idea that they're too different to regulate is baloney. And so, we need to obligate farmers to reduce the pollution that's coming from their land, then give them the choice of what they want to do. We don't have to come there and tell them, look, you need a wetland, or, you need cover crops or whatever. We need to go there and tell them, look, the nitrogen load coming out of your tile can only be this. You figure it out, you do whatever you want, but it can't be any more than this or you're going to get fined. And so we really need to look at this. And so the evidence that this voluntary adoption is going to work for nutrient pollution, it just is not there. It's not there. We have a continental scale problem. There's no evidence at all that this can be solved through individual actions. There's no examples that you can show where that has happened.
I appreciate you're always the straight talker, Chris. That's a good way to kind of end the bulk of our session here. Because I knew this would go fast. This time would fly by. I just wanted to leave with 3 other quick suggestions that are only small scale ways to get involved. I've heard of people planting cover crops in their gardens just to kind of get a sense how cover crops work. The Mississippi, there's a group called Project Aware that physically cleans up sections of the Mississippi River. They go out in the summer and collect garbage and things like that. And Big Grove Beer is selling a new beer called Greener State of Mind with proceeds benefiting Wings to Water. So there you go. You could drink some beer and benefit the Mississippi watershed. But that's all the time we have today. I just really want to thank our panelists for finishing out the day strong. Tegan Wendland from the Mississippi River Basin Ag and Water Desk, Chris Jones from the University of Iowa, and Mike Schmidt with the Iowa Environmental Council. Thank you, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I invite our audience to come back tomorrow to the Energy and Environment track for 2 morning panels. I'll be moderating the first one, which is at 10 a.m., which is on large energy users. So we're going to have the Bitcoin mining site CEO and talk about data centers and how they affect the power grid. So thanks, everyone, and have a great night.